It's 3 a.m. in a high-rise hotel room overlooking a city that's sleeping beneath a halo of neon haze. Rain beads against the window, streaking trails of liquid silver. Inside, a man paces the carpet like a caged animal, eyes bloodshot, jaw locked tight enough to snap a tooth. On the table sits an untouched glass of whiskey. A pack of cigarettes lies torn open beside it, though he doesn't smoke. His hands hover over the glass, retreat, hover again. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. His name is Denzel Washington. If you're watching this video right now, chances are you know who he is. Two-time Oscar winner. One of the greatest actors of his generation. A man whose performances have made people cheer, weep, and leave theaters changed. The kind of man whose mere presence demands attention, respect, and maybe even fear. The last person you'd ever expect to find standing at the edge of a hotel balcony, wrestling with thoughts so dark that one slip would send him plummeting into eternity. But that's precisely where he was. And tonight we're going to tell you how he got there, and how a single voice, drifting through a late-night TV screen, stopped him from taking one fatal step. Because this is a story not about Hollywood glamour or movie premieres. It's about the moments nobody sees. The private breakdowns behind public smiles. The nights when someone who seems invincible is held together by threads so thin that the wrong word, or the right one, can decide whether they see another sunrise. And it's a story about Steve Harvey. Yes, the comedian, the talk show host, the man whose booming laugh has filled television screens for decades, who once lived in a car, scrubbing up in public restrooms before walking onto a stage. The man who has made millions laugh, and who, in one spontaneous, unscripted moment, spoke words that saved Denzel Washington's life. There's a saying that every comedian is crying on the inside. But what happens when their words become someone else's lifeline? When a joke or a speech delivered to keep their own demons at bay becomes the single thing keeping another person alive? That's the story we're about to explore. And before this video is over, you'll hear the words Denzel spoke to Steve. You'll see Steve's reaction. A man who thought he was merely surviving his own night of pain, only to discover that he'd saved one of Hollywood's brightest stars. So let me ask you a question. Have you ever saved someone's life without even knowing it? Or has someone's words, some stranger on TV, a passing conversation on a train, ever stopped you from making the worst mistake of your life? Because sometimes salvation arrives wearing unexpected faces. Denzel Washington wasn't always the giant looming over movie screens. He was once a kid in Mount Vernon, New York, son of a Pentecostal preacher. He grew up disciplined, raised on faith and fierce work ethic. But he also grew up carrying expectations as heavy as iron weights. Expectations to succeed, to never crack, to always be the hero both on screen and off. The world knows him as the man from Malcolm X's Training Day glory. The man who can silence an entire auditorium with a glare. But few people know that even as cameras flashed and trophies lined his shelves, he was sometimes crumbling on the inside. That at the height of his fame, while millions adored him, he felt utterly alone. In Hollywood, you're only as beloved as your last box office hit. One flop, and rumors swirl like sharks in blood. Studios turn cold. Friends vanish. And for someone like Denzel, whose identity was built on strength, masculinity, and invulnerability, admitting he was in pain wasn't an option. But pain doesn't care about pride. It comes for everyone, regardless of how many awards sit on your mantle. So how does a man like Denzel Washington, a man who has inspired generations, end up in a hotel room at 3 a.m., contemplating the end of his own life? And how does a comedian who once slept in his car become the unexpected guardian angel standing between Denzel and that final leap? We live in a world where we worship fame. We think celebrities have it all: money, adoration, power. We assume they float above the struggles that drown the rest of us. But beneath the tuxedos and golden statues, they're as human as anyone else. They bleed, they despair, and sometimes they stand on the precipice, one breath away from vanishing. That night, the hotel room felt like a tomb. Denzel flipped through channels on the TV, searching for noise to drown out the voice in his head. The voice telling him he was finished. That Hollywood didn't want him anymore. That all the roles, the fans, the interviews, it was over. He found Steve Harvey. And in the middle of the night, Steve wasn't cracking jokes. He was speaking from a place so raw, it felt like he was bleeding words onto the stage. Steve was talking about failure, about nights when he'd wanted to disappear, about how faith was the only thing that kept him alive. Steve's voice poured through that television like light through stained glass. And Denzel, standing on the edge, heard something that made him step back. He chose life. And years later, Denzel would look Steve Harvey in the eye and tell him, "That night, I chose life. Because your voice reminded me who I really was. You saved me, Steve." Denzel Washington did not come into this world as a legend. He arrived on December 28, 1954, in Mount Vernon, New York, a modest suburb where ambition was often a luxury and survival was the main pursuit. His father, Reverend Denzel Hayes Washington Sr., was a Pentecostal minister known for preaching the gospel with a voice that could shake rafters. His mother, Lennis, managed a beauty parlor, working long hours to make sure her children never missed a meal or a lesson in discipline. They were a family bound together by faith, but even faith can't shelter a child from every storm. Growing up in Mount Vernon meant you learned quickly to stand your ground. You learned that respect was earned, never given, and that even the smallest mistakes could have consequences that rippled out into the rest of your life. Denzel was a serious boy, tall for his age, with eyes that seemed always to be studying the world for hidden meanings. His mother called him an old soul. He was the kid who would rather sit quietly in a corner reading scripture or adventure stories than join the other boys in the street. Even then, he carried a certain gravity, like he was waiting for something big to arrive. His parents' marriage began to fray when he was still young. The arguments behind closed doors grew louder, sharper, until eventually the split came. Denzel was sent to a private preparatory school, hoping it would keep him from drifting into trouble like so many of his peers. But no school, no matter how polished, could erase the ache of watching a family come undone. He learned early that pain could be hidden beneath discipline, that a calm face could conceal a storm. It was a lesson that would serve him well when he stepped onto the stage years later, becoming an actor who could wear any mask and make you believe it was real. Denzel's first brushes with performance came almost by accident. He tried sports, dabbling in basketball and football, but nothing caught fire in him the way the theater did. It was in a small community production that he felt the first flicker of something larger, a sense of purpose that anchored him when everything else felt uncertain. When he enrolled at Fordham University, he was still a young man trying to figure himself out. He drifted between majors, uncertain if acting was a real career or just a distraction. But in the dark of the campus theater, under the heat of the stage lights, he found a clarity he couldn't ignore. He began studying his craft with the same intensity his father had once poured into his sermons. While other students partied or relaxed, Denzel spent long hours dissecting scripts, learning the mechanics of character and motivation. He was not content to be merely good. He wanted to be great, though he never would have dared to say it aloud in those early years. It was at Fordham that he performed in a student production of The Emperor Jones, a role that demanded every ounce of his emotional strength. For the first time, he understood what it meant to lose yourself completely in a character, to become someone else so fully that your own fears and memories slipped away, replaced by the heartbeat of another life. After graduating, he attended the American Conservatory Theater in San Francisco. But within a year, he was back in New York, impatient to start his professional career. He landed a role in the television film Wilma, where he met Pauletta Pearson, the woman who would eventually become his wife and the quiet force behind his most important decisions. In 1982, he was cast in the medical drama St. Elsewhere, playing Dr. Philip Chandler. It was a groundbreaking moment. The series was one of the first to portray an African-American doctor as a complex, multidimensional character, and Denzel brought to the role a dignity that set him apart. Television opened the door, but it was the movies that would transform him into something more than an actor. His breakout film role came in 1987, when he played the South African activist Steve Biko in Cry Freedom. The performance earned him an Academy Award nomination, and for the first time, Hollywood began to see him not just as a promising young actor, but as a man whose talent could redefine the limits of what black actors were allowed to portray. In 1989, Denzel took on the role that would cement his status as a force of nature. In Glory, he played Private Silas Tripp, an escaped slave who joined the Union Army's first all-black regiment. The film is remembered for many things: the stirring battle scenes, the unflinching look at racism within the ranks, but it is Denzel's performance that still lingers decades later. In one unforgettable scene, Tripp is whipped in front of his fellow soldiers. As the leather cracks across his back, his face remains impassive, eyes locked on something far away. Then a single tear spills down his cheek. It was a moment of shattering vulnerability and defiance, a glimpse into a character whose pride could not be broken by any cruelty. That tear became legend. It won Denzel his first Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor, and it announced to the world that a new kind of star had arrived. A man who could embody both ferocity and tenderness without compromising either. But the success came with expectations as sharp as the applause. Hollywood has always demanded that its chosen ones keep ascending, higher and higher, until there is nowhere left to climb. And Denzel was determined never to be satisfied with being just another leading man. He was determined to be an artist. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, he built a body of work that few could rival. Malcolm X, The Hurricane, Training Day. Each role was a study in contrasts. Saints and sinners, heroes and tyrants. And each performance peeled back another layer of his own humanity. Off-screen, he was famously private. He rarely gave interviews that strayed into his personal life. While other celebrities courted the tabloid spotlight, Denzel kept his distance. To many, it seemed like a sign of strength, a refusal to let fame consume him. But in that reserve, there was also isolation. When you are the symbol of resilience for millions, where do you go when your own strength begins to falter? Who do you turn to when you've built a life on never showing weakness? These questions haunted Denzel more than he ever let on. Because no matter how high he climbed, there was always a voice in the back of his mind whispering that it could all vanish in a moment. The more his fame grew, the more carefully he guarded his private battles. He poured himself into his work, into his family, into the perfection of his craft. And when the lights went down and the audience stopped applauding, he returned to hotel rooms that were too quiet, too empty, and too full of thoughts he didn't want to name. It is easy to look at the towering figure he became and forget the boy from Mount Vernon who never quite believed he deserved to be here. Easy to forget that behind the fierce intelligence and charisma, there was a man who sometimes felt he was living someone else's dream. This chapter of his story is not about the awards or the box office records. It is about the long road that brought him to that balcony at 3 a.m., the path paved with expectations, triumphs, and the silent fear that one day, it would all come crashing down. Because before a single word from Steve Harvey could save him, Denzel had to face the reality that even the strongest men can be brought to their knees by the weight of their own legend. And in that darkness, all the applause and golden statues in the world could not drown out the question echoing through his mind. What happens when you can no longer carry the story the world demands of you? That is the question that would eventually drive him to the edge. But it is also the question that would make him step back, when a stranger's voice reminded him of something he had forgotten. That he was more than his roles, more than his fears, more than the expectations that had nearly destroyed him. Fame is a strange currency, can buy adoration, power, opportunities that others only dream of. But it also buys isolation, suspicion, and the constant fear that one day, the world will wake up and decide you're no longer worth remembering. For Denzel Washington, fame arrived gradually, like a tide rising inch by inch until he was suddenly standing alone on a mountaintop, looking down at a world that adored him. It was intoxicating at first, the standing ovations, the awards, the directors clamoring for his presence. Each new role felt like a triumph, another brick in the fortress he was building around himself. But even as the fortress grew higher, cracks began to form. From the outside, Denzel's career looked unstoppable. The man had Oscars, critical acclaim, respect from peers. He was the kind of actor whose name could greenlight a film. Yet behind the scenes, the machine that is Hollywood had begun to show him a different face. The industry he loved was a place of ruthless cycles. One year you're hailed as a genius. The next you're a has-been. One disappointing box office result, and the phone grows silent. Scripts stop coming. People look away at parties. The very people who once laughed loudest at your jokes are suddenly busy with someone newer, shinier, more marketable. In private moments, Denzel struggled with something few people saw, a fear that everything he'd built was temporary, that one misstep would bring it all crashing down. He became obsessed with perfection. Directors admired him for it. Crew members told stories about how he'd stay on set for hours, repeating a single line until it rang true. He didn't just memorize scripts. He dissected them, memorizing not only his own lines but everyone else's. He demanded the same excellence from everyone around him. Yet there was a cost. People whispered that working with him could be exhausting, that he was intense, driven to the point of alienation. And though he was never cruel, his silence could be terrifying. He had the presence of a man perpetually wrestling invisible demons, eyes focused on something far beyond the set lights. This drive for perfection wasn't merely artistic. It was survival. For Denzel, every role was proof that he still belonged, that he hadn't lost his touch, that Hollywood hadn't decided to discard him like so many others. And then came the media. The tabloids live to remind the public that stars are only human. One day, they're writing glowing profiles. The next, they're dissecting your private life, hinting at scandals, predicting your decline. Denzel's private nature only fueled speculation. Why so secretive? Was he hiding something? Rumors swirled, some true, most absurd, about feuds with directors, demands on set, or personal crises. Denzel ignored it publicly, but the whispers chipped away at his armor. He wasn't naive. He knew that in Hollywood, silence creates narratives. If you don't tell your story, someone else will. And the version they tell is almost never flattering. But opening up felt impossible. Vulnerability was weakness, and he couldn't afford to look weak. Not in an industry where sharks circle at the first hint of blood. So he built walls. His interviews became increasingly cautious. He deflected personal questions with jokes or cryptic answers. He smiled for red carpets, but the real Denzel stayed locked away. Even his closest friends sometimes found themselves shut out. And the loneliness grew. There's a peculiar kind of solitude that comes from being beloved by millions yet known by no one. People see your face and think they know you. They quote your movie lines, shake your hand, tell you that you've changed their lives. But when the cameras turn off, you're alone in a hotel room, staring at the city lights and wondering if any of it means anything at all. Denzel began spending more time by himself. Late nights became routine. Insomnia haunted him. He would walk the streets of whatever city he was filming in, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Sometimes he went to church services in unfamiliar towns, slipping in quietly and sitting in the back, searching for something he couldn't name. He prayed, though sometimes the prayers felt hollow. He kept thinking about all the men who had come before him, black actors who'd broken barriers, only to fade into obscurity when Hollywood decided they were no longer profitable. Denzel didn't just want to succeed, he wanted to endure. He wanted to leave a legacy that would outlast the fickle tastes of studios and audiences. But the fear gnawed at him. What if it all disappeared tomorrow? There were moments when the cracks widened into chasms. Like after a film that critics savaged, a film he'd poured himself into, believing it might be his masterpiece. When the reviews came out, brutal and mocking, he sat in his trailer staring at his reflection in the mirror, wondering if the world was finally done with him. Or the times when roles he longed for went to other actors. Younger actors. White actors. When producers whispered that maybe the world wasn't ready for a black man to lead certain films, no matter how famous he was. Each disappointment carved deeper lines into his spirit. He became guarded even with family. His wife, Paletta, tried to break through. But there were things he couldn't say, fears he didn't know how to express. To speak them aloud felt like giving them power, and so he held them in. But holding in darkness comes with a price. It builds pressure like steam in a sealed chamber. It finds its way out in sleepless nights, in moments of rage, in tears that come without warning. The facade of invincibility became heavier each year. He smiled for cameras, signed autographs, gave motivational speeches, told the world to follow their dreams. And then, alone at night, he wondered if he had the strength to follow his own advice anymore. He never imagined telling anyone how close he'd come to the edge. That was a secret he planned to carry to his grave. Because for Denzel Washington, vulnerability was dangerous. It was a risk he believed he couldn't afford. Until that night in a hotel room, when he found himself pacing the floor, staring out over a city that glittered like broken glass, believing there was only one way left to silence the voice in his head. And as he stood there, contemplating a step from which there would be no return, a voice crackled through the TV. A voice so unexpected, so raw, that it sliced through the darkness and pulled him back. That voice belonged to Steve Harvey. But before we can understand what Steve said that saved him, we have to understand the man who spoke those words, and the hidden darkness that drove him to speak them in the first place. A hotel room in a major city often looks the same, no matter how expensive it is. White sheets, a heavy curtain that barely holds back neon glare, a minibar stocked with overpriced bottles. It's a place designed for transients, a room you pass through, not one you stay in to confront your soul. But on one particular night, Denzel Washington found himself trapped in such a room, pacing between the desk and the balcony door as if crossing those few feet could somehow carry him away from the thoughts closing in on all sides. This was not merely a bad night. This was the culmination of years of slow erosion, of tiny wounds that had finally gathered into a single gaping chasm. It started, as these things often do, quietly. A film that had been his passion project, one he'd fought for, financed partly with his own money, released to critical indifference and weak box office numbers. The critics didn't just dislike it, they mocked it. Headlines used words like misstep, overreach, past his prime. In Hollywood, failure is rarely private. It echoes through meetings, through phone calls between agents, through subtle changes in how people greet you at a party. Suddenly, the next big director who'd once insisted Denzel was perfect for his films stopped returning calls. Producers who used to seek his input began moving meetings to smaller rooms, shortening conversations, ending calls with polite phrases like, "Let's circle back in a few months." Nothing explicit. No one ever says, "We're done with you." That's not how Hollywood works. Instead, the coldness spreads like frost, inch by inch, until you're left standing alone in a room you used to command. Denzel felt it acutely. For years, he'd been the safe bet, the star whose name alone could justify a movie's budget. But Hollywood is addicted to novelty. It wants fresh faces, newer stars, younger energy. Some executives whispered that maybe Denzel's time had passed, that he was too old to carry action roles, too serious for comedy, too intense for the romantic lead studios wanted to push. He could see it in the scripts arriving on his agent's desk, roles smaller, less complex, with fewer lines, offers for supporting characters instead of leads. And even when the leads came, they were riddled with studio notes, suggesting he soften his delivery, lighten up, play it more broadly for mainstream appeal. But how do you ask Denzel Washington to play it safe? Denzel had built his entire reputation on truth, on digging into characters until he struck something raw and honest. To him, the craft was sacred. To the studios, it was a product that needed to be packaged and sold. Each suggestion felt like an insult. But the worst wound was the sense of invisibility. For a man who'd spent decades proving himself, the sudden indifference was unbearable. Denzel had been fighting to exist on his own terms since the beginning. Now he was being told, subtly but unmistakably, that Hollywood's terms were changing, and he might not fit into the new blueprint. He tried to pretend it didn't bother him. He smiled on red carpets, gave polite interviews, thanked the fans. But at night, the mask slipped. He began sleeping less, eating less. He lost weight without trying. His wife noticed first, urging him to talk to someone. But Denzel waved her off. Therapy was for other people. People who didn't have to be Denzel Washington. That refusal to open up was the iron rule he'd lived by his whole life. Vulnerability wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. It invited gossip, rumors, headlines. He'd seen other actors try to be honest about mental health, only to be branded as unstable or difficult. So he held his silence. Until one night, when the silence nearly devoured him. He was in town filming a movie. A film he wasn't sure he believed in, but work was work. He'd finished the day's shoot, retreated to his suite, and found himself alone with thoughts he couldn't drown out. He sat for hours, staring at his own reflection in the darkened window. The city sparkled below him, alive with possibility, yet he felt utterly outside of it all. He wondered if anyone would notice if he disappeared. In his mind, a voice repeated the same words over and over. It's over. He didn't know if it meant his career, his life, both. He poured a glass of whiskey but didn't drink it. He tried turning on the TV, searching for something to distract him. Every channel felt hollow. Comedy specials, dramas, infomercials selling miracle cures for insomnia. It all felt like noise echoing off the walls of a crypt. The ache in his chest grew heavier, pressing down until he couldn't catch his breath. He stepped out onto the balcony. Cool air hit his face. He leaned forward, gripping the rail so tightly that the metal dug into his palms. The drop below seemed to pull at him like a magnet. He was not thinking about his movies or the awards or the standing ovations. He was thinking about silence, about the simple peace of not having to fight anymore. Because that was the part no one talks about. How exhausting it is to be strong. To carry a legend on your shoulders every waking hour. To be the man people point to as an example when all you want is to be human for 5 minutes. He stood there for a long time. Wind whispered through the buildings. A neon sign flickered, casting purple light across the balcony. Then, without really deciding why, he turned and went back inside. He flipped through the TV channels, half mindless, until a familiar voice filled the room. Steve Harvey. But it wasn't the voice of a game show host. It wasn't comedy. It was something raw, stripped bare. Steve was on stage somewhere, sweating under lights, gripping the microphone as if it were the only thing holding him together. And he was talking about failure, about nights when he'd slept in his car, praying for the sun to come up because he couldn't face the darkness anymore, about how he'd tried to hold himself together with jokes and faith, even when he felt like dying. Denzel froze. Steve's voice wasn't performing. It was confessing. And in that confession, Denzel heard a truth he hadn't let himself acknowledge for years. That even the strongest men break. And that breaking isn't the end. Tears filled Denzel's eyes. He fell onto the edge of the bed, staring at the screen as Steve Harvey bared his soul to strangers. Steve spoke of faith as a rope you cling to when you're dangling over the abyss. Of how sometimes the only thing between you and the end is a single word, spoken at the right time. Denzel felt something shatter inside him. A dam bursting, years of silence flooding out in the darkness. And in that flood, a new voice rose in his mind. I'm not done yet. He turned off the TV and sat in silence, chest heaving, tears streaming down his face. The whiskey remained untouched. The balcony door stayed closed. He chose life. That night became a secret he guarded like a sacred relic. He told no one, not even his closest friends, that Steve Harvey had saved him. To the world, he kept being Denzel Washington, unbreakable and proud. Until years later, when he finally decided to look Steve Harvey in the eye and tell him the truth. But before that confession came, we need to understand the man whose words turned Denzel back from the edge. Because Steve Harvey, too, carried secrets darker than the jokes he told. There's a moment in Steve Harvey's life that almost no one knows about. Long before the suits, the shiny studio lights, and the roar of television audiences, he stood on a freeway overpass outside Cleveland, gripping the railing, looking down at the traffic flashing by beneath him. He was broke, hungry, homeless, and he believed that maybe the world would be better off without him. That's the part of Steve Harvey's story that never makes it into the comedic monologues or the flashy intros of his shows. The world knows him as the funny man, the host who can turn a single word on Family Feud into viral gold. They know the mustache, the tailored suits, the booming laugh. But behind that laugh is a man who has been to the edge and come back. Not once, but many times. Steve was born in Welch, West Virginia, in 1957. His family was poor, so poor that he once joked his first name was Puh, because they couldn't afford the other two letters. His father, Jesse Harvey, was a coal miner. His mother, Eloise, was a devout woman who taught him that faith was the only currency that mattered when money ran out. From a young age, Steve was a storyteller. He'd sit on porches, spinning tales for neighbors who gathered just to hear the funny kid talk. Even then, he had that gift, the ability to read a room, sense its energy, and shift the mood with a perfectly timed punchline.